Welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Eric Olson
and Jayden Garcia.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Westin MCAT podcast. I am your host, Eric, along with my buddy Jayden. Jayden, how's it going?
Good, man.
You're a couple weeks. You're a few weeks into PGY 2. Do you feel like you can take on the world at this point, or how are things going?
That's a rough transition, I think.
Really?
I think every time we do this thing where we level up, it just, you feel so lost and clueless all over again.
Oh, how are things different for you?
There's a lot more responsibility overnight. You know, I took a lot of general surgery call overnight, and they don't really trust intern to take nose and throat call because of our airway emergencies overnight.
Sure.
So that has been new, kind of taking call for ENT, and I've already had some crazy kind of stories in just a few 2 or 3 nights that I've been on call. So in some ways, it's a really great learning opportunity, but you just felt helpless a lot of the time, and I'm hoping that feeling gets over pretty quick.
Yeah. What is your call schedule like?
4 calls a month. It's pretty kind of set that way, so it's not terrible.
Yeah.
When you're on, it's very long. It's like 28 hours straight, and it's quite busy. There's not really a lot of time to sleep or anything like that. So I don't mind the frequency, though. I'll take it, you know.
I'm just glad you didn't say like every 4th day, because I know it's I think I did a colorectal surgery rotation in med school, and I guess it was the intern, but the intern was on every 4th day or every 3rd, and then they had the next day off or something crazy like that. I guess it was only for a month.
Yeah, that would just not be sustainable with the type of call we take. But
yeah,
what about you, man? What's it like finally being a dermatologist?
Yeah, I mean, it's not 28-hour call yet or ever.
Forever.
I agree with you. Like, you know, I appreciate the terminology of like leveling up, and it's just very different. It's like we were talking with Ahmed last week. Or a couple weeks ago. I don't remember what exactly we were talking about, but I started kind of waxing poetic about having to start over so frequently. Just in medical training, you know, like you learn all these things as an undergrad, you take the MCAT, and then some of that stuff comes with you, but you kind of start over to a degree in your preclinical years, and then you kind of do the lectures and go to class, and then you start over a little bit as a clinical student.
Right.
And for me, you know, I started over as an intern. Now I'm kind of starting over as a dermatology resident. So it's just a lot of kind of new beginnings, and definitely doesn't sound like it's been as rigorous per se. Well, as physically taxing, I would say, but it's been a lot all at once, you know. Yeah. Our program is like, and I think probably most dermatology programs are a little bit more academic in that, like, I guess I don't know what your program looks like, so forgive me if I'm stepping on your toes, but we have like lectures every day, and there's a lot of like discussion, not really in like an internal medicine sense, but there's a lot of discussion around like, you know, what is this disease entity, and like what does it look like, and what's on your differential. Like we have these conferences every week where they like put a picture of something up on the board, and they're like, okay, like just, you know, describe this, and, you know, what's on your differential, what kind of, you know, like either what testing do you want to do, or like, do you want to do a biopsy, or would you just treat, and with what, and what are your options? And you can do that in any field, but it's like a little bit daunting in dermatology because these conferences are like with the whole department. And then it's just hard going like at the same time as people who are a year or 2 ahead of you, if that makes sense, because they know so much more, and you're kind of like thrust in there like, okay, you know, you participate just like you're one of the rest of us, and you're kind of like, I just started doing this like 2 weeks ago. So, like, I just don't, it's a little bit like of imposter syndrome, you know?
Yeah.
But, you know, that's the same the same no matter what you're doing. You kind of start and you don't know what you're doing, and then you figure it out as you go.
I do feel like we're in similar boats, and I think kind of uniquely, we kind of chose fields that doesn't get much representation in general medical training. I certainly didn't feel comfortable with anything related to the skin, and I don't think a lot of people get a good, ENT grasp. And so I don't know if we experience this more than others, maybe not, but I do think it's a unique challenge to kind of leave medical school and feel more comfortable in so many other fields than your own.
Yeah.
And, I imagine you'll dive right into dermatology, and in a matter of months, you'll feel much more confident, but it's tough, being somewhere else for a year and then all of a sudden you're a second year, and it's crazy. You only have 2 more after this year. So we've got to squeeze in a lot of skin knowledge in the next 3 years.
We call ourselves first years.
First years, yeah.
Starting,
I get that.
Anyway, well, good stuff. I'm hoping for the best for you. I know PGY2 is a tough year for you guys. I think in ENT and I think in urology, that's like one of the tougher years because you're young, you're new enough to like have to take the heavy load, but you're old enough that you kind of know what you're doing.
Right. That's not a great combo, but yeah, we'll get through it. We have a great topic today. All you listeners out there, the feeling that Eric and I share right now of feeling very lost, confused about how to proceed and navigate is not, it's not just as a early medical resident. The undergrad pathway to just get to medical school also has so many ways to approach getting there. And I think Eric and I have kind of thought a lot about what we could talk about today that's a little bit aside from MCAT specific. We wanted to kind of bring a topic that we think is helpful for all of you pre-meds. And we imagine if you're taking the test, you're also thinking about these things. And what we kind of had in mind was to discuss extracurriculars. It brings up an important aspect of an application. It's, I would say, essential. It's necessary to have checked that box. And hopefully today we can shed some light about what we did or didn't do, and maybe where we did check the box or where we wish we could have more. But I guess, Eric, if we could kind of jump right in, just in a broad sense, what did kind of your application look like? What do you feel are key elements of extracurriculars? What advice would you give? And those are lots of questions, but feel free to just kind of open it up to whatever kind of comes to your mind as far as extracurriculars go. We'll go from there.
Yeah. Well, I will start by saying that I think we like to talk about extracurriculars and we like to overthink it and talk about it and discuss what should I do this? Should I do that? Where should I spend more time and all this stuff? At the end of the day, I really believe that getting into medical school is, I don't want to say so much more based on, but the cornerstone of a good medical school application is having good grades and doing well in the MCAT. That's what I believe. I'll make the caveat that people feel differently. People will give you different advice. The two of us sat on admissions committees, and I don't know, what exactly your experience was, but I feel like people came at it kind of from different perspectives. And so even at the same institution, you may have people who have kind of different opinions. So I don't pretend to speak for, every person who's ever going to look at your application, right? But I'll tell you kind of what I think, and maybe it's a little bit biased by my own experience, but the way that I looked at applications anyway. And I think a lot of schools traditionally, maybe not so much anymore, but traditionally had GPA and MCAT cutoffs. That's the thing that gets published is what was the average GPA and the science GPA and the MCAT scores. And so I think from a metrics perspective, they like to keep that, higher than lower. And if it were me and I had a choice between volunteering at the park for 5 hours a week for a semester and like spending those 5 hours studying for the MCAT, I would probably do the latter. Because I think it's more important and I think it's higher yield. Like going to the park and volunteering is not going to make or break you. But if you get a 5.18 versus a 5.12, like people are going to look at that differently, 5.12 is a great score. But that is my first caveat, I think, is like, it's great to talk about and like try to have robust extracurriculars, but I think the curriculars to me are kind of the platform that you then build on. Before I go on, Jayden, do you have any other thoughts on that? Do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. You just can't, and we've stated this before, it's really hard to work your way out of a bad GPA or a bad MCAT score, regardless of what the extracurriculars look like. I think you highlighted why, so many people deem this process of applying to medical school a crapshoot.
Yeah.
Right. That's the term that often gets used in like this medical journey of applications, whether it's to medical school or to residency. It's a quote crapshoot, and I think you had highlighted people just feel differently about various things. You don't know whose application is, or who's going to read your application on that admissions committee. That could be somebody who doesn't resonate with your story or with what you did or accomplished at all. And it may be somebody who reads it in 5 seconds, feels super connected to what you've done, and almost will give you an interview right off the bat because of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you don't know. Hopefully by our discussion, people can understand big principles that they can apply to maximize that net that they throw or make it the most efficient possible, so that, a good majority of people who read your application can connect with it or feel like it's overall a positive thing. So I agree. I think we should consider extracurriculars as an important aspect of the application. But if you are somebody struggling with taking the MCAT or doing well in school, you have to prioritize those over these things we're going to talk about in some ways.
Yeah, they're not going to make up for poor GPA or poor scores. So let me talk through some of these categories. So like, there are different categories of sorts of extracurriculars that you're supposed to be involved in, right? And they used to, I looked around the internet before we started this a little bit and looked at a couple different programs. And they used to publish like guidelines or even like requirements some schools had of like, this is how many like shadowing hours you have to apply, like for us to look at your application. And I just looked at a couple of programs and I didn't see that in just a couple that I looked at. Maybe that still exists at other places and I just had a bad sample, but I think that there's like a movement away from quantifying things. Step 1, which is one of the board exams, went from a numerical score to pass fail a few years ago. And that's a board exam. It's like a medical school thing. But I think the principle is the same for pre-medical students and for medicine admissions, right? That like we talk about GPA and MCAT, but I think they're emphasizing more and more some other things and other experiences that you have. So I don't know if there are like hard, fast rules about how much time you should be spending on things. I think the general principle, as you said, Jayden, that I would recommend or suggest is like, if you're going to do something, it should be something that you care about. And you should spend, a significant amount of time doing it. And if you can think of some experiences, if you can have some experiences that are of interest, that people might ask you about in interviews, that's kind of like you want to catch someone's eye with some of these things. And the reason I frame it like that is because, and I'd be interested to hear your take on this, Jayden. Maybe we've talked about it before, but I felt like at our undergraduate institution, I've heard it said before, and this may or may not be true, but I've heard it said before, I read somewhere that like BYU had like the highest rate of like putting people into medical school. It's like a big undergraduate institution. They have like 30,000 undergraduates at a given time. And a lot of people wanted to go into medicine. And so In any case, like it's a big school. There are a lot of people getting into medicine. So there was kind of like, I don't want to say there was a set pathway, but there were like certain things that lots of people did that were like, this is what a good medical school application looks like. And here's what people have done and continue to do that like are those things. Like we had this big service organization umbrella called YServe that was like, it had all these like sub organizations under it. And it had this very like defined structure of like there was a program leader and there was like an executive leader and then there were like sub people. And I felt like everyone I knew who was going to medicine like picked one of those organizations and was like, I'm gonna, volunteer with YServe. And so I did, I did like it was called Provo Youth Mentoring, and we like brought in like I think it was fifth graders from these at-risk school districts, and they came to the university, and we would like talk to them about school and education and like the different things you could study and stuff like that. It was fun. It wasn't something I was like super passionate about, but I did it for 4 years, and I put a lot of time into it. But looking back at it, it was kind of something I did to check a box, and I think that's tough about med school admissions is like at the end of the day, there are boxes you probably should be checking. And so like you have to find something. Like you can't just not volunteer. Maybe you could, but I would not recommend it.
Right.
You find something to like get outside of yourself, right? And so that was one of the big things that I did, that I spent a lot of time on. Again, like I wasn't particularly passionate about it. I don't think you have to be passionate about everything you participate in because
Right.
sometimes you have to check a box. But it can help, and you should have some things that you're passionate about. Like the things that I volunteer in now are like related to dermatology or like in areas of practice that I'm interested in. And I don't do very much at all. I do maybe like an hour or two a month, which is kind of, like a very different setup than when you're a pre-medical student. But like find something that you're interested in and like be very involved, make a difference if you can, make a change so that you can say like, here's what I saw in this organization and I wanted to change something. Like people like that. At the end of the day, you're going to have to write a blurb about each of these extracurriculars. And so if you can say, instead of like, yeah, I like showed up and talked with kids for an hour every month, instead if you say like, well, I won't get into it, but like, the principle of the thing, like I noticed that there was this. And so I, spearheaded, an effort to change the way that we, paired mentors up with students based on their interests or something like that. And that I think shows initiative that means a lot more. So that was kind of, from a volunteering perspective, like the big thing. And I'll say like the kind of categories that we'll be talking about: volunteering, shadowing, clinical experiences, research, and leadership are kind of some of the different categories that we look at when we're thinking about extracurriculars and what we should get involved in. But Jayden, what do you think about volunteering specifically, or about any of this, about like how to approach extracurriculars as a whole?
Yeah, Eric, I think you brought up some really key points. To echo some of them, I think there's really two options as somebody who's looked at a lot of applications. At the end of the day, there's an actual person who's going to read your application, and the goal of that experience is to stand out. It's really hard to get an interview if you don't stand out. There's just so many other applicants who are qualified. And I think you could do that in two ways. And I think you brought this up. You may be the one who did YServe, for example, like at our undergraduate, and a lot of other people who may be applying to that same school from your school could have the same thing on the application.
Yeah.
Or you could do something that's very unique that nobody has. And I think both can get you to the goal. Certainly the one who did the more common thing, or maybe the more popular thing, is at a little bit more risk for not impressing somebody.
It's harder to stand
out. It's not
out.
like it's not impressing, right? It's more the standout. It's not like it's impressive, because things that you do that other people do could still be equally as impressive. But again, standing out, that's kind of the phrase I want to use. But I would say that if you try and either spin it in your application or describe it in a way that makes you stand out in like a unique fashion, the same two people could do the same thing and have different outlooks, different reasons why they did it. I think that's your highest chance at standing out, is trying to, highlight something that makes you different as to why you participated in that. And I agree with you entirely. This other principle, if you're not going to love everything you do, I still feel like there are things I am doing currently to check a box to get to the next level, which for me is fellowship. I've already thought about that. And I think Eric brings up this good point. But I will say, there are certain things that a lot of pre-meds do. We'll get into like clinical care, but EMTs, a lot of people apply being an EMT. Scribing, a lot of people apply being scribes. So if you are going to go into those, it's not wrong. Try and spin it in a way that does make you unique with the goal of standing out. If there are unique opportunities that you don't think anybody else has done, I would jump on those, and especially if you are interested in it. But I do think, don't feel like you can't explore something you are interested in just because other people do it.
Yeah.
Because that does come out in the interview. You may get the interview and it really, the passion can come out there in person or over Zoom or whatever you're doing. Anyways, those are my 2 cents on like the broad overview of like choosing extracurriculars. And I think volunteerism. Oh, the one other thing I'll say about volunteerism. Imagine a scenario, you have somebody who went to Guatemala for 2 weeks and did this amazing humanitarian trip. And then you have somebody else who spent 3 to 4 hours a week for all of undergrad. One, I will say, blanket statement here, will almost always be accepted as like the more impressive, more standout applicant, and that is that longitudinal case.
Yeah.
I think try to have as much longitudinal experience as you can. Yes, 2 weeks in Guatemala helping kids with cleft lip and palate is like super cool. But longitudinal experience showing you're dedicated over a longer period of time tends to be more impressive.
That's
about
hard.
Everyone.
That's hard to show that dedication, right? And we know that, like people know that. And so I think that impresses.
Did you have anything on that category, Eric, of like, I don't know, longitudinal volunteerism of some sort?
I mean, the YSERV thing was
was that all through college, or how long did you do that?
I did it for 3 years, 3.5 years. It's a long time.
That's different than somebody doing it just for like a semester, which I again, I had some things on my application that were short-lived.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But for me, that was, I volunteered at like a food bank where I helped kind of coach people who were impoverished, build a plan where they could kind of go shopping within the food bank, and they were given a budget, and we kind of talked about their progress every week. And I did that for almost 4 years. And that came up very frequently in my interviewing, I think because it was something I did for so long. So something to consider there.
Yeah, I think even if you have no idea what you're interested in, that's where kind of the passion comes in. Like I don't speak for you, Jayden, but like I don't know if you were really passionate about like food banks, right? But like you can just pick something at the beginning of your undergraduate career, or a year or two in even, and showing that year or 2 or 3 or 4 of dedication to a cause, even if it's not like part of your story,
right?
Is impressive to people.
Yeah.
Right? You talk about the uniqueness, and I'm just thinking this is like getting a little bit ahead. We don't have to go into the specifics quite yet, but there was a summer. It was the summer that I was applying, and I had a research internship at the NIH that was like an opportunity for me, which fits kind of in the category of like that's a cool thing, but like people do it, right? It wasn't like completely unique. And then I had another opportunity that was like it was like healthcare consulting at this firm in Salt Lake City. And it was like some like very junior sort of thing, but it was nice to be in DC for a summer. Like my wife's family is there. We spent time with them. It was great. But sometimes I think back and I'm like, as far as opportunities go, like that was a really unique thing. You know, like, that would have made people would have been asking about that. And so the point being, like, NIH is great and it was like a good thing. But I think the uniqueness, like someone's going to read that and be like, that's really weird. Like, that's cool. I'd like to know more about that. You know, whereas the NIH was like, people kind of know what it is. It's less out of the box. So I don't know if there's like a right answer, but just like how I've kind of approached it from my like current perspective. The next thing I want to touch on briefly is shadowing.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about shadowing, Jay. To me, it's like you could shadow for 200 hours. And I'm like, if you spent, 2 to 3 hours a week for 4 years volunteering instead of shadowing, that's much more impressive to me. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, I think traditionally it was like to prove that you were interested or something. I don't know. I like didn't think it was that big of a deal when I was applying, and when I looked at applications, I was like, good for you, did some shadowing. I think I probably did about 60 or 70 hours over 4 years though. And I knew, early on that I wanted to do medicine, so it wasn't like I saved it all up for the end. I think if I were going to do it again, I think 100 hours is like more than enough, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally.
The one thing that I would say is like, I would do it in a few different fields. I wouldn't spend 100 hours with a neurosurgeon or an orthopedic surgeon. It's like very specialized. It's kind of it's not exactly siloed, but it's a little bit apart from like medicine as a whole. And if you, had like a bunch of research in like bone regeneration and had done a bunch of shadowing with an orthopedic doctor and had like, I don't know, it pays like to have a story, but I also think there's something to be said for like an interest in the breadth of medicine. So at least from a shadowing perspective, like I think I shadowed a neurosurgeon, I shadowed a dermatologist, I shadowed a primary care doctor, and I shadowed an ENT. And if I could do it again, I would shadow only like primary care specialties, like general surgery, family medicine, internal medicine. That's what I would do. I don't know what you think about that, but I think it's okay to shadow specialists, but from like I'm interested in medicine as a whole and like taking care of people. To me, I feel like shadowing a pediatrician, even if you don't really want to do that, it shows a little bit more like interest in medicine and empathy. I guess I'm having a hard time like putting it into words, but it feels like a better choice to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think if you go the specialist route, it gets a little bit harder to explain if it gets brought up.
Did anyone ever?
I had a couple of people ask why I shadowed certain people. I think that's on the table. Yeah, it wasn't common. I don't think Eric, I think this is very much if there's anything on this list of things that we have to do, this is probably the most check the box one.
Absolutely.
I think it's a red flag if you see somebody less than like 10 hours, but to your point, I would stop right away. If you're more than 100, just stop.
Yeah,
it just feels like doing anything to benefit your application. I'd say, I don't know, what do you think? 30 plus? Like, I think even if you're 30, if you have another robust application, that's totally fine, in my opinion. What do you think?
30 is fine. I would probably, if it were me, I'd probably do like 50. I would probably do like 50 to 60 and call it good. Because again, like, there are just other things you could be doing. Like, you're not really contributing anything as a shadower.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Let me ask you this then, because I know a lot of pre-meds have asked us this before. Shadowing can actually be a hard thing to find for a lot of people. Do you have any tips?
What did I do? I feel like I might have just called. Around. I know that because like my family's not in medicine. I don't like know anyone. The one primary care doctor was someone I went to church with. And I just asked him, I was like, hey, I'm applying to medical school. I'd seen him around. I think it's helpful to work connections if you can. Even if you know a specialist, like most of them will know other doctors in other fields, if from nothing else, from like referrals,
Yeah.
But I thought, I had pretty good success, but when I needed someone to shadow, I would just call. Or at one point, now I'm thinking about the specifics, because the primary care doctor I met at church, the neurosurgeon I just called and I was like, hey, I'm interested in this. Like, can I come hang out with you? And he was young. He was like just out of residency. So I think and it was not an academic center. So I think he was like interested in, giving back some. The ENT I called and just asked if he accepted shadowers. She said, yeah. And then the dermatologist, I was at the dermatologist and he had a shadower. And he was super nice. And he said, if you ever want to shadow, I know you're wanting to do medicine. If you ever want to shadow, just let me know. And I was like, yes, I actually do.
Yeah.
But it's really hit or miss, I think. Sometimes you get lucky, other times not so much. But I think just, being forward and asking around is what I did. And it seemed to be pretty effective. I don't know. What did you do?
I had some connections through like remote friends. I didn't have anybody in my family. Certainly if you do, that's the easiest path.
It's a good in.
If you don't, or you don't have any friends, if you're a part of a university with a medical school, that's probably your go-to, like University of Michigan, University of, Utah, wherever it is, like Associated Medical School, go right there. All of those doctors are used to having students. You and me, Eric, we didn't really have an institution that had a joint medical school, so I think it becomes a little trickier. I would say, you're probably going to be doing some sort of clinical activity, and which is one of the buckets we're going to touch on at some point. I would say if there's an institution associated with that activity, try and target that. I think almost all physicians are pretty willing to have students. The big barrier is like the HIPAA compliancy, and various big institutions have the most rules about having shadowers and things like that. So you'll probably find more luck with like smaller private practices that don't regulate this all that much. If you go to some big, HMO or something like that, there's going to be like tons of forms to fill out. The benefit of if you get in, you'll probably have access to a lot of different specialties, like Eric was saying, if you want to, not spend time with just one. So those are a few thoughts, but it's not always easy. Some people actually struggle, as we've seen over the years, to get their foot in the door with shadowing. But hopefully
but I wouldn't stress too much about it.
No.
You get your foot in one or two doors, maybe.
Right.
In a couple of days, and then wash your hands of it, is my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. You don't need to do much.
You touched on patient care or clinical volunteering, different from like non-clinical volunteering, right? Which is what we were talking about previously. What did you do, and how does this kind of stack up in your hierarchy of things?
Yeah, I had two significant activities that were a lot of hours at the end of the day and were for at least 2 to 3 years each. I worked I spent it as like a healthcare tech. I don't know what I actually put down, something similar to that, at like a rehab facility for patients who were trying to get over substance and alcohol use disorder. It was kind of like an inpatient home.
Yeah.
Worked there for a long time and had a lot of great stories to tell during interviews about that. And then I worked as a scribe as well. So I definitely fell into that category, at least with that one, of something maybe less unique. But I do feel like I ended up spinning it in a way that made it unique for me, at least.
I think if I may just briefly, I think scribing is a great opportunity. Honestly, I think it's probably, I don't know, I didn't do it, so I don't know, but I imagine it's helpful for like actual patient care when you become a doctor.
So helpful.
Familiarity with the notes and things, but I will just make a plug of like, don't do scribing for like 2 years and be like, I scribed for 2 years. This is like such a great extracurricular. Like it's going to open all these doors,
Right.
because of these things that we're talking about. Like the longitudinal aspect of it is great, but at the end of the day, like you did a job, like you got paid to do a job. Yes, it was patient care, but like it's something a lot of people do. It's not like I don't want to say like self-abasing, because you don't need to do something that's like hard or like selfless on your application per se, but like it's just not that thing. It's not the thing that's going to like put you over the edge.
Right.
You know what I mean? Sorry for interrupting. You continue.
No, that's exactly right. I think people fall trapped to that. We've seen it as they've sent us their applications where they feel like one particular thing is going to do it, and it's just not. I think scribing is a common thing that people do. I would advocate to doing it in person. There are a lot of people who scribe remotely, and I think you miss a lot of the benefits of scribing. If I could say the most powerful thing about scribing is if you're doing it in person and you do get to know doctors over 2 years, I found that the letters of recommendation, which is another piece of application, is just much better. I mean, my application, I got to see a couple of the letters that people wrote for me. The one that was written by one of the doctors I scribed for was by far the best. I mean, he basically sent all these praise and things like that of like specific interactions that we had, and then had me add anything that I wanted to, and was able to send it off. So it is a good opportunity to get physician letters, which is another pain point for a lot of applicants. Is if you're not shadowing all that much and you're expected to have a physician letter, how do you do that? Especially if you come from an institution where, like you and me, Eric, again, we didn't really have a medical school where the people we're doing research with were physicians. So that could be a pain point. So it's something to consider if you're in that circumstance. But I agree wholeheartedly that it's not the end all be all, and you shouldn't think basically anything that you individually do as part of your application is going to put you over the edge. I think it's kind of a culmination of a lot of the things we've talked about on the podcast before. But yeah. What about you? Did you have much of a clinical care base?
Honestly, it was probably the weakest part of my application.
Yeah.
I had a buddy who was a few years ahead of me, and he like did an EMT thing. I don't know if his grades were great, but he was like an EMT on campus, and that was like his thing. And similarly, like I think he kind of leaned on that, and he ended up like not getting in. He reapplied like I think 3 times or 4 times before he got in somewhere, and it kind of like he was still reapplying by the time I started college. And so I had thought about like being an EMT. I thought it could be cool, but I was like, I don't know. This guy did EMT and it didn't work out for him. I don't think that like hurt him per se, but again, I think he leaned on it, like we've kind of been talking about. And so that's a similar thing. I think being an EMT is great. Similarly, like great experience, like from a practical standpoint. But it's not the thing that's going to get you in, right?
And you could have one of the greatest experiences and totally portray it poorly. I think one of these times on the podcast, we ought to talk about tips to filling out the MCAT
writing the application. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen some of the most amazing experiences just not even come through at all on the activity section. I'm like, I'm confused. What did you do? Or, wow, you made this sound really bland when I know it was not. And I think once you've gotten the interview, assuming you had a pretty good extracurricular application, I think the extracurriculars are what make the interview, right? You're not going to talk about your MCAT score or grades, not once in an interview. Your extracurriculars are going to be the like fodder for answering questions. And I would advocate for everybody listening to keep track of unique and cool experiences you have in this, so that when you are getting ready for interviews, you can look at those again and draw upon them to answer questions. Because nobody's going back at the interview level and be like, oh, so-and-so spent 1,500 hours as a scribe. No, but they will if you used a very powerful story doing something as an EMT or, a Spanish translator or whatever you're doing. Like, those stories are what somebody's going to have to remember you by when your face comes up at the admissions committee meeting.
Yeah.
And so I think try and turn the experience into something powerful. Keep track of those experiences, draw upon them in your personal statements, in your activity sections, and probably most importantly in your interview.
Yeah. And they'll ask about those things. It's good advice to list out experiences. As
you forget if you don't, there's a lot you do over 4 years, and it's easy to forget if you don't keep track.
I did 2 things, and neither of them were like super longitudinal. One was I worked or volunteered with a hospice organization and like went to visit people who were actively dying, basically. Maybe not actively, but which is kind of a downer.
Yeah.
It's like an important experience for me, honestly. It was I don't know. I just came from such a place of like knowing nothing about medicine, and anyway. So I think I only met with like 3 patients over a year or a year and a half, maybe. And then I worked at a hospital because I think I had done that and I was like, this is not quite enough. Like it was only a couple dozen hours. And so I worked at a hospital and did like helping patients find where they were going and like cleaning rooms. And I spent part of the time in the emergency department and then part of it on like the surgical, like the OR floor, like helping patient families get from place to place and giving updates and stuff like that. It was like not anything special. Like I said, I think it was a weak point in my application, but and maybe that's why I'm like scribing or EMT, like it's not a huge deal. Again, like I agree with Jayden. Those are helpful if you have a lot of hours, and at the end of the day, like it's helpful to have some stories because I had maybe one story maybe from the hospice volunteering, but like the volunteering in the hospital, it was like very low level.
Yeah.
And didn't really have experiences with patients or anything like that. And so I don't remember ever getting asked about it. And it was a good thing because it was kind of a filler for me. You know what I mean? And some things might be like that. You might have one category or another where you're not as strong. And, it's hard to be perfect on everything. And frankly, as we said in the beginning, if you do, you have to try not to just be checking boxes, right? And I think those were things that I did to check the boxes, and that happens sometimes. But if I were going to do it again, I would probably just have done one or the other and spent a lot more time doing it and like really tried to dig into it and make it something that I cared about. It's nice to have more than one thing, but if you can't talk about it, which I couldn't really because it was pretty uneventful, it's not going to help you when you get to the interview stage.
Yeah, this idea of like the interview stage, what really helps convert a paper application to an acceptance at that stage, I think is very interesting. We just recently had this kind of discussion as an admission, or I shouldn't say admissions committee, but like our residency match committee or whatever you want to call it, because we've struggled with this, because if there is any part of this medical school application that has more to do with the interview than anything, it is probably clinical experience and volunteerism. And how do you, reward others who may not have the strongest application in those domains when the interview, like in research, for example, or other aspects are just so qualified, but they chose not to focus on one of these things that is kind of biased by the interview. Like, yeah, somebody who has a whole bunch of clinical experience, maybe worked as a nurse or worked as a, I don't know, an EMT or something that has all these cool stories to draw upon, like that person's going to have more, assuming that they're social and they're able to kind of convey a story, that person's just going to have more luck in converting interviews to acceptances than somebody who really excelled in research, because that only goes so far, right? As far as like social conversation and behavioral questions, which are becoming more popular, tell me a time when you did this or did this or this. It's just, I think, easier to draw upon more personal interactions. Research is not as much personal interactions. And so I've just seen this a lot where pre-med students are super loaded on some of these other aspects like research or, I'm trying to think. Mainly research is the one I probably see the most. And they're super qualified, but they just don't have as much oomph to talk about in interviews. So it's just something to consider. I don't have answers, but it's a problem. I know a lot of people are thinking about it. How can we reward everybody equally for where their heart lies and where they've spent time? Because the reality is it's not that way currently. And I do think, I don't know, if you're a pre-med out there trying to beat the system, it may be the most advantageous to get the most clinical experiences, because that's where the interviews kind of focus on, or maybe most simple. I'm rambling at this point, but I don't know if you had any closing thoughts on that, Eric.
No, I would just say, before we move on and talk about research, to me, like there's a certain degree of trying to know what you want to do with your life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard starting out as an undergrad, but the reason I say it is because certain schools are going to be more focused on one thing or another. Like if you are going to school, doing your undergrad at, I don't know, UMass, and you really want to go to Harvard, just because I know those two schools are in the same state, then like get on Harvard's website for their medical school and like look at their mission statement and like what are they showcasing of that their medical students are doing? You know what I mean? If it's all about research, then like maybe you should think about research and be doing that and be like, this is my passion, and hopefully you are passionate about it. I certainly wouldn't suggest like deceiving or trying to lie to the admissions committee, but if you are really interested in going to, I don't know, some other school, and you look on their website and it's all about serving the underserved and disparities in healthcare, then like do that. Schools have different emphases, and so it's like you won't be able to cater to everyone. But if you have places in particular you really want to go, like, it doesn't hurt to like look at that on the front end and try to tailor yourself to meet kind of the image that they're trying to portray.
That's an application strategy that I hope everybody listened to get a leg up on certain places. If you have something that you're about, that they're about, it helps, I think, come out. So,
and regardless of like what you are doing prospectively, like if you get to the application stage and you're like writing a personal, like a secondary essay for X school, then look at what they are interested in and tailor your statements and your essays to that school, right? I was pretty research heavy. I thought about doing an MD PhD for a while, and so we'll talk about research briefly. I think I don't know, Jayden. I don't know if I'm a great person to talk about this, just because like I remember when I was just back from Brazil, and for those of you and maybe I haven't said this, but I did a semester of school as a freshman, and then I went to Brazil for 2 years as a missionary, and then I came back and did 3.5 years. And the first semester I was back, I was in this molecular biology lab, and it ended up being like what changed my major to molecular biology. I really liked it. But anyway, I remember there was another guy in there who was a pre-med, and he was talking about research, and like he was in some lab and X, Y, and Z, and I was like, research sucks. I'm never going to do that. And then the more I like read about it and such, I was like, I should really probably like do this. It probably will be helpful for my application. I think most places probably would like you, at least most MD schools would like you to have something. I don't think they expect a publication or, if you have a presentation or two, that's great. It shows that you were involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, getting involved in an undergraduate lab and spending, more than a semester or two at that lab, I think is pretty helpful. I think it's like reasonable to try to do a poster, even if it's just like at your institution. They have little poster competitions. I mean, I guess it depends on where you're at, but I think that can be helpful. I also do research over the summers. I think if you've done, one or two summer research experiences, that would be enough as well. Just to show that you like dipped your toe in the water and had some interest and gave it a shot. And then again, like Jayden said, I mean, a lot of the purpose is to have something to talk about, and the research things like kind of depends on who you get of whether they're going to want to ask you anything about your research. Like the probability lies with they're going to know nothing about what your research was in, and so they are not going to care to ask. And honestly, it might be scarier if they did know what your research was in, because then they know a lot more about it than you do, probably. It's kind of a lose-lose, but anyway, for me, I like asked around at different PIs, faculty members at my institution, until I found one that was willing to take me. And then I stayed there for 2.5 years, I think. And then for the summers, similarly, like I would just reach out. I would just, I wanted to spend the summer at the NIH, and I like asked around. I asked my friends who were from the area if anyone knew anyone. I know people who had success just like cold emailing and being like, hey, I'm an undergraduate student. I'm interested in insert research topic of the PI here. And do you have space for me in your lab this summer? And, sometimes labs have extra funding and they can pay you, I think I got paid $2,000 a month for a couple of months during most of these experiences. So it's like, it's kind of a job. It's kind of an internship. It's kind of just like an extracurricular research opportunity. But I think if you want to do an MD PhD, like you obviously have to be super involved. But again, I think, having your toe in the water and having, one or two projects, maybe one or two posters, show publication, it's great, but I don't think it's going to make or break you. And I say that like, if you have a publication, it's not going to make you, right? It's not going to break you if you don't have one. So I think I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Jayden. Like I said, I mean, I had like kind of skewed myself that way, because I got into it and I kind of liked it and I thought about MD PhD. And so that's where I spent a lot of my time. And do I think it was helpful? Like, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, like what was helpful for my application was that I did a lot of things, and a lot of them I spent a good amount of time on. And so it showed dedication and my grades were good. Like that's kind of the end all be all of my application, was that I checked the boxes. I had a couple things that I was passionate about and I got good grades. But I don't know, Jayden, what do you think about research and kind of where it fits and how important it is?
Yeah, I struggled with this one more than anything. I keep coming back to this. I think we have some reasonable insights for people who, again, come from an undergraduate institution without a medical school, but it's a significant difference as far as opportunity. I mean, I would like beg people at our institution to take me, and
I did some begging too, and
there was so much begging, and I just struck out so many times, like, oh, we're full, oh, we're full, oh, we're full. And I mean, I ended up getting a good opportunity with somebody who had an opening, but it delayed things quite a bit. I did not have a publication, and I'll say a word of wisdom here. To Eric's point, you don't need a publication. I didn't have one, but it is nice if you can get some sort of scholarly work on there. And you're just going to have, unless you're like super invested in wet science or basic science or something like that, if you have opportunities for clinical research, you'll get that experience more to go present a poster or do a podium presentation as an undergrad. I just think very few people get to do it through basic science. It's just tough. Those discoveries and things worth mentioning at a conference, just it's a lot of failures. It's a little bit of luck. I mean, some of the most impactful, I'd say the most impactful work in science is basic science. But for like checking a box, if I had to give advice to people I care about, I would probably favor doing clinical research over basic science, unless you have like a very strong interest. And again, that trumps everything. I didn't, and I just didn't have access to clinical research, so that makes it tough. So I knew going in, like I checked the box. I was in a lab long enough. I think I ended up getting into a lab where I could spin it in a way that, was something I was interested in. But I knew when I applied, that's never where I was going to wow somebody. And I think each one of us who apply know that you're going to have one of those categories. I think the important thing is you check all the boxes and you have a couple of things that really make you stand out.
Yeah.
And it may not be across all 5 categories we've discussed, There were just too many, people were applying with crazy, ridiculous publications. Some had PhDs. I'm like, I can't compete with that. That is not what I'm going to be talking about in my interviews. If they ask me about my research, I'd say you should know your research inside and out if you put it on that application. Within seconds, it becomes apparent if you know what you're talking about, or if you fibbed in any way about your involvement in the project. So I would know that cold. Anything you put down on that application with regards to research, know cold. But it just wasn't what I highlighted. And this is another, like a last point about research. I've seen grave mistakes where people on the MCAT application choose, their 3 most important activities or something like that. And they feel like they have to put their research experience down because it's research. That is just not true. You can put down what really is the most interesting, because a lot of reviewers may only go to those 3 activities.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people put down their research experience, and I've even seen shadowing experience, and that's a big no-no. The research is fine if that's what you're passionate about, and again, that's what you stand out in. But for me, that would have been a grave error. I didn't stand out in any way. Why would I put that as my top 3? So I just recently read an application where somebody did that, and I'm like, you need to change this, because it's not where you stand out. You don't have a publication. You've only been in a lab for like 6 months. Don't put that as your most remarkable. Like, choose something else that you're super stand out,
Yeah. I love it. I think we've touched on everything. Is there anything we're missing? I think we hit them all.
I think we did.
You know what? We might not have hit leadership, but I don't think I really have anything to say about leadership. I think you can fit the leadership category into any of the other 4.
Yeah.
No, probably not shadowing, I guess, but like non-clinical or clinical volunteering or research, or, whatever else.
Yeah.
But just, I guess, just look for opportunities to make a difference. You don't have to be like the captain of such and such. You can, like say you led an initiative to do such and such in your research lab, or, something to that effect.
And you can tell people, let's say it's like volunteering at a food bank like I did, when you get hired, you can say like, look, I'm trying to get to medical school. One of the things I want to demonstrate is leadership. Over the course of the next couple of years, if opportunities arise for me to take some leadership opportunities, I would love to have that chance. And sometimes people will even create positions for you that will give you a little bit of responsibility so that you can highlight that. So
it's not about the title. It's about what you write about what you did.
Exactly.
It's great to say you were executive director of something, but if you don't have anything to say about it, then it's probably not as good.
The titles just get made up anyways, right?
It's true. They always do. I'm losing light here. I've been sitting in front of the window and I'm getting pretty dark. So I think we'll have to sign off. Jayden, any closing thoughts before we go?
No, hope that was helpful. Don't forget, MCAT's more important.
We're pulling for you guys. Best of luck with your studying and with your extracurriculars and with everything else that's going on. And we'll see you next week.